Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Archaeologies of Violence and Privilege, edited by Christopher N. Matthews and Bradley D. Phillippi, narrated by Jonathan Yen and Teri Schnaubelt. Publisher's note: this audiobook refers to figures and tables included in the print and e-book editions of the book. 1. An Introduction to Archaeologies of Violence and Privilege. Christopher N. Matthews and Bradley D. Phillippi. While certain kinds of suffering are readily observable, and the subject of countless films, novels, and poems, structural violence all too often defeats those who would describe it. Paul Farmer. Violence rides rampant in contemporary society, though it is arguably an essential part of what makes modernity, and some say humanity, distinct. From state violence to the violence of war and genocide, from interpersonal violence to the way social lives are structured and symbolized by and through violence, we confront people doing terrible things to others almost every day and across almost every field of interaction. As archaeologists, we are additionally exposed to forms of violence that occurred in past decades, centuries, and millennia, adding the depth of time to our understanding of human cruelty. Archaeological evidence of past violence emerges in the surviving remains of broken bodies, destroyed homes, hallowed battlefields, vacated and polluted places, as well as erased pasts. We also see violence when we work to understand why people commit atrocities, hoping to see beyond their rationalizations for injustice to what lies closer to their obscured hearts and minds. This effort forces confrontations at the intersections of past and present, as well as conservative and progressive agendas that can easily erupt in new forms of violence in defense of a worldview, or, at times, lead to painful transcendence as a former way of life is abandoned. Regardless, exposing the suppressed struggles of structural violence that drive some cruelty reveals quite a lot about how persons, communities, nations, and cultures exist and intersect. The problem, as Paul Farmer describes in the epigraph, is that getting at the violence resident in the hearts and minds of those we study can be quite difficult. For Farmer, one solution lies in documenting suffering, especially as it is embodied in individual lives. We think archaeologists are equally empowered to do the work of documenting the materiality and embodiment of suffering. This book presents a series of archaeological studies of the early and late modern eras that document, in specific times and places, how past social formations rested on violent acts and reproduced violent social and cultural structures. The authors bring to light, through an interpretation of material objects, spaces, and their relations, how past communities perpetrated and faced modern forms of violence. A thread connecting the individual case studies is a focus on less observable structural and symbolic violence, in addition to more direct evidence of violent acts. This is captured in our title, Archaeologies of Violence and Privilege, which ties the social and cultural advantages bestowed upon some to the way violence was unevenly distributed and experienced in past societies. The premise is simple. For privilege to exist, there must also be forms of violence that sustain and defend it. Robert Kennedy captured this understanding of violence in a concise speech following the assassination of Martin Luther King, Jr. As riots erupted across the United States, Kennedy said the following: "Too often we honor swagger and bluster and the wielders of force. Too often we excuse those who are willing to build their own lives on the shattered dreams of others. Some Americans who preach nonviolence abroad fail to practice it here at home. Some who accuse others of inciting riots have by their own conduct invited them. Some look for scapegoats, others look for conspiracies, but this much is clear. Violence breeds violence. Repression brings retaliation, and only a cleaning of our whole society can remove this sickness from our soul. For there is another kind of violence, slower but just as deadly, destructive as the shot or the bomb in the night. This is the violence of institutions, indifference and inaction and slow decay. This is the violence that afflicts the poor, that poisons relations between men because their skin has different colors. This is a slow destruction of a child by hunger, and schools without books, and homes without heat in the winter. The potency of the statement is evident, as Kennedy shows that the interconnections that bind Americans are infused with violence, repression, resistance, and retaliation. He also identifies that this violence is found not only in what we see in riots, but also in the institutions, indifference, and inaction that sustain and characterize the majority. What is more, this very same speech could have been given dozens more times by other public figures in the 50-plus years since 1968. Similar sentiments, in fact, have been shared in responses to other devastating public executions. In response to the police shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014, the Reverend Jesse Jackson said that Brown's death was part of a pattern around the country of a black man being shot by white police, falsely arrested, stop and frisk, excessive jailing. This is a kind of lynching in 2014. In 2013, the Malcolm X grassroots movement published a report stating that killings of black Americans by law enforcement, security guards, and stand-your-ground vigilantes have increased from one every 36 hours in the first half of 2012 to one every 28 hours by the end of that year. Massive public protests around the world following Michael Brown's death, and again following subsequent police killings of young black men in Baltimore, Charlotte, Minneapolis, New York, Pittsburgh, and other places, make us aware that the experience and acknowledgement of institutional violence are widespread. Also writing in response to the shootings of Michael Brown, legal scholar Linda Sherrill Green argues that individual instances of police deadly force against unarmed black men are enabled by a legal jurisprudence of structural violence which provides no accountability for the societal marginalization and stigmatization of young black men, as well as by a jurisprudence of actual violence, which permits police officers to decide whom to target and whom to kill with virtually no threat of criminal sanction or institutional civil liability. She notes as well that there are significant disparities between whites and people of color in terms of being victims of a crime and having their cases addressed and resolved by the police. Green is stating effectively that police violence and killings are not incidents solely related to the events and the people involved. Rather, they reflect institutional structures within police departments and society at large that support racism, segregation, and unequal jurisprudence. That is, they are examples of structural violence that position people, because of race, class, and other markers, into different and hierarchically ranked categories of humanity. Forms of structural violence are found not only in law enforcement, but also in employment, housing, education, and health care discrimination. Moreover, the violence experienced across these arenas together produces radically unequal life chances among American and global citizens. Many listeners will know the Black Lives Matter movement, founded by Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi in 2013 in response to the shooting of Trayvon Martin, an unarmed teenager, by a Neighborhood Watch vigilante. The organization gained national attention following the Michael Brown killing a year later. Black Lives Matter is a grassroots network of organizations advocating for reform in criminal justice, as well as other arenas where Black lives are systematically and intentionally targeted for demise. Its leadership of protests in Ferguson, Missouri, and elsewhere brought an understanding of structural violence in ways not seen before. It focuses on affirming Black folks' humanity, our contributions to this society, and our resilience in the face of deadly oppression. The purpose and voice of Black Lives Matter have inspired a wide range of responses, including negative ones, such as organizations framed by mottos such as All Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter. But for many, acknowledgement of the reality of structural violence in American society is something new and important to understand. Since 2014, professional and academic communities have looked with more clarity at their own positions to identify ways they perpetrate and benefit from racial, gender, sexual, class, and ability inequalities. Archaeologists, for example, have recently examined the issue of sexual harassment in the field, lab, and classroom, especially in light of the Me Too movement. This concern stands with a long-acknowledged but poorly addressed fact that professional archaeologists are overwhelmingly white, and that most archaeologists in senior and supervisory positions are white men. It was in the spirit of Black Lives Matter and its consciousness-raising effects that Brad Phillippi and I chose to organize a session on archaeologies of violence and privilege at the 2016 conference of the Society for Historical Archaeology in Washington, D.C. Our goal was to bring together colleagues with a shared interest in the archaeology of violence. However, we asked contributors to think specifically about the relationship between violence visible in the archaeological record and the sources of power and privilege that were imposed and sustained through these violent acts. The session was very successful, and we are pleased that many of the original participants have contributed chapters to this book. We are, of course, also pleased that the authors in this collection have carried forward the same spirit that led Brad and I to put together that session. In sum, we think this book presents a compilation of diverse case studies that show how archaeology can identify and interpret structural violence in the recent past. We hope these studies inspire future research in this field of study and support the global effort now underway to reform the institutions and cultural traditions that perpetuate social injustice against vulnerable people. In the following section, I provide a brief review of related research in anthropology and other social sciences on the topic of structural violence. I then discuss the chapters that follow. Studying Structural Violence. Nancy Shepard Hughes and Philippe Bourgois write that everyday forms of state violence make a certain kind of domestic peace, that is, privilege, possible. Slavoj Žižek identifies structural violence as invisible and objective, such that it is the background or the normal, peaceful state of things. It is, in reality, the dark matter that has to be taken into account if one is to make sense of what otherwise seem to be irrational explosions of subjective violence. In other words, the idea of senseless violence is only possible when we also have a simultaneous conception that violent acts, speech, and indifference play out on, or explode from, a presumed field of non-violence. The problem, as Žižek observes, is that the visible acts and agents of subjective violence are just the tip of a vast field of structural violence that is essential to the cultivation of objectivity and normalcy at the outset. Thus, the subjectivity of violence, its explosive character and seemingly senselessness, founders when it is understood to be simply a manifestation of what Pierre Bourdieu and Loic Vacan call the order of things. Paul Farmer sees this sort of violence as the process through which various large-scale social forces, such as racism and poverty, come to be translated into personal distress and disease, or the hard surfaces of individual suffering. Farmer's goal is to inform the study of the social machinery of oppression, and he sees this machinery based in the materiality of the social order. Archaeologists gain from Farmer a sense of materiality that is at root social and cultural, since he insists that, as anthropologists, we are trained to work hard to understand the historical and political economic contexts of those people and events we study. While other disciplines have generalized or de-socialized their approaches to suffering, Farmer argues that anthropology, and we include archaeology, remains committed to recognizing that bodies, objects, places, acts, and ideas do not exist, or at least do not matter, in the abstract, but emerge, suffer, succeed, and expand solely in concrete material conditions that we must understand. Moreover, as these conditions are primarily social, they tell us about the actual relations between people and groups that inflict violence and sustain privilege. This is why his appeal to consider the insights of liberation theology, or the restorative work that moves immediately to the structural analyses of oppressive forces and denounces systems, structures, and mechanisms that create a situation where the rich get richer at the expense of the poor who get even poorer, makes sense. We simply add that Farmer's interest in understanding both the rich and the poor in liberation theology is reflected here in our interest in understanding the archaeology of privilege and violence. Sustaining privilege also requires various forms of defense. In modern society, based on the establishment of far-flung colonial and post-colonial networks and the development later of economies based on mass production and consumption, and complex and enormous urban centers, there is a premium placed on strategies and tactics of social control. Direct physical violence can be an effective defense of privilege, but it is costly and atomized. It is also constrained, since only individuals or small groups can be physically violated, coerced, or contained. Structural violence such as racism, the way communities and cultures are designed and operate through the exclusion of some as foreign, lesser, and disposable, or poverty, such as when prosperity and perceived success are made visible through conspicuous consumption, and when failure, in turn, is designated as the result of personal deficiencies or decisions, provides a farther-reaching and more efficient way to establish and preserve privilege. In fact, according to Hannah Arendt, direct physical violence lacks the legitimacy of structural violence, since the perpetrators must waste effort in demonstrating their authority rather than being able to take it for granted. The use of symbols, in both discursive and material forms, to cohere the privileged to one another, despite other often obvious material differences among them, is thus a relatively inexpensive and more efficient way to sustain social advantage. Again, race can be used as an example, such as in Du Bois's notion of the wages of whiteness, which explains that working-class American whites earn a psychological wage from being white that affords them greater security and privilege in the United States than non-whites, regardless of their levels of education, social status, or wealth. Another part of defending privilege is how structural violence constructs a range of violent acts, from the symbolic to the physical, as expected, routine, even justified, by those who commit them, as well as by their victims. As opposed to instances of shocking corporeal violence, such as mass shootings, that can trigger official reactions, structural violence desensitizes populations to its effects, most clearly evidenced in the lack of any social response to violence at all. So, for example, the mass incarceration of young men of color remains tolerable in the United States, even as increasingly visible police violence against this community is called out. It is thus imperative for researchers to interrogate the violence of social structures and symbols, as well to consider how these are related to more overt and less socially acceptable forms of violence also witnessed in modern society. An important method for this kind of research derives from Bourdieu's conceptualization of symbolic violence, which rests on a process of misrecognition. Symbolic violence is the violence which is exercised upon a social agent with his or her complicity. Misrecognition sustains symbolic violence in the way people fail to see or deny the economic and political interests present in a set of practices. Instead, these interests are misrecognized as representing disinterested forms of activities and resources. Researchers often attribute misrecognition, which is sometimes glossed as a form of Marxian false consciousness, to working-class and marginal people who buy into dominant ideologies, such as individualism and the American dream in the United States. In this case, the violence of a false egalitarian ideology is in part perpetrated by its victims on themselves. The concept of misrecognition also works in reverse, such that those who commit violence against others may misrecognize their actions as disinterested, unrelated, or even good works. Misrecognition in this direction leads to a failure to recognize, most of all, a position of privilege. Bourdieu calls this privileged position symbolic capital, or the benefits gained from the transformation of self-interest into disinterest, that allow violent offenders to remain out of sight and inculpable. The chapters. The following chapters elaborate on these themes and illustrate how material objects, spaces, and practices represent the results of violent acts and have been arranged to support the misrecognition of economic and political interests and thus the reproduction and defense of privilege. As a collective, we recognize that there are topics and themes not covered herein. For example, none of the authors considers the relationship between routine corporeal violence against enslaved laborers and the quietude of the master's home. Nor is there a study of the massacre of indigenous people for the sake of opening lands to new settlers. These themes are essential to understanding the ways violence and privilege have been entwined to make the modern world, and many archaeologists have explored these topics. Rather, the chapters that follow examine somewhat less dramatic, if not less studied, though no less powerful moments and processes in the American past and its archaeological interpretations. Reinhard Bernbeck's chapter considers privilege inherent to archaeology and related historical research. He outlines an approach framed by the concept of recognition, or the way human subjectivity is at play in the documentation of violent acts. While both victims and perpetrators of violence are present at the time of the act, it is not uncommon that one or both are absent, ignored, forgotten, or downplayed in the specific frameworks employed to document the events. Drawing on Axel Honneth, Bernbeck argues that violence is the result of forgetting the original nature of intersubjectivity, or the recognition of the other as a subject, by those involved as well as by those reporting on violent acts to others. Forgetting intersubjectivity leads to objectification and, in more extreme cases, to reification, such that those who suffer or perpetrate are no longer seen as one of us. Speaking directly to archaeological and historical practice, Bernbeck cautions strongly against the scholarly reification of the violence of past people and events through photography, materiality, and narrative. He quotes novelist Peter Weiss, who writes regarding a group viewing the graphically violent 3rd century Pergamon altar in a Berlin museum. The work gave pleasure to the privileged. The others sensed a segregation under a draconian law of hierarchy. The point is that the archaeologists, in this example, solidarize with powerful, but also that all that is preserved, displayed, interpreted, and valued reflects the subjectivities of multiple persons, both past and present, who have engaged with artifacts. At no point are objects fully mute, but, as with Zizek, their presumed objectivity is the result of definitive social subjectivities that have created and deployed them for various, sometimes violent, purposes. Guido Pezzarosi's chapter on Discursive Violence and Archaeological Ruptures examines the sharp external conceptual divide between ancient and modern Maya communities. While the ancient Maya are well-known archaeological subjects, famous for their ceremonial centers in southern Mexico and Central America, the contemporary Maya are considered a fallen population whose existence can be juxtaposed to modernity. Pezzarosi points to a variety of factors for this impression, including the cultural changes and violence of colonialism, a prized ideology of mixed heritage, or mestizaje, and the collusions of archaeologists who typically work in the Maya region without the consent of the descendant community. Clearly, separating the living Maya people from their past is a powerful form of symbolic violence. Yet Pezzarosi notes that a great deal of Mayan archaeology highlights the idea that the ancient Maya themselves were violent, a discourse that fuels a popular theory of cultural collapse that has underwritten the career success and privilege, that is, symbolic capital, of many archaeologists and other experts. To counter this trend, Pezzarosi researches colonial period archaeological data showing that Maya people not only survived their supposed ancient collapse, but also developed successful strategies to persist as a distinct people, despite well-documented and objectively violent colonial-era efforts to control and destroy them. Sadly, even this persistence is discounted, since their survival strategies imply a lack of cultural continuity preferred by archaeologists and the Guatemalan state. Catherine Sampeck also considers the violence of colonialism in her chapter on Spanish colonialism and spatial violence. She engages the spatial theories of Michel Foucault to propose an approach to place as not just the location of violence, but as a tactic of violence itself. Her focus is the spatial actions of Spanish colonial authorities over indigenous communities in both Central America and the North American Southeast. She examines in particular the Spanish practices of congregación, reducción, and policía, which moved indigenous populations into nucleated communities where they could be more easily surveilled and habituated into a colonial way of living. A firm basis of Spanish authority derived from an imposed morality, which was made evident in such spatial urban forms as racial segregation and the centrality and prominence of the church building. It was also revealed in the use of the public space for corporeal punishment of Indians. Less visible structural tactics of violence were also place-based, such as high rents and fees for public festivals that drained the wealth of indigenous people. Sam Peck closes her chapter with a discussion of widowed landscapes, former indigenous...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?